The sun had just begun its ascent over Silver Rest Grove, casting a golden hue over the pristine suburban neighborhood. Towering oak trees lined the neatly paved sidewalks, their leaves whispering in the gentle morning breeze. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee from the boutique cafes a few blocks away, mingling with the scent of dew-kissed grass. The town was waking up, residents emerging from their homes for their morning routines. Some sipping coffee on their porches, others walking their purebred dogs, their laughter light and carefree. For Lenora Blake, this morning felt no different from any other. Clad in sleek athletic wear, she jogged along the winding path that wove through Silver Rest's well-maintained parks. The rhythmic sound of her sneakers hitting the pavement, the distant chirping of birds, and the soothing voice from her podcast created a sense of calm. This was her sanctuary, the one time of day when she allowed herself to simply exist without the weight of her job pressing down on her shoulders. Lenora had worked tirelessly to get to where she was. As chief inspector of the State Ethics Bureau, she had spent years dismantling corruption, exposing abuse of power, and holding officials accountable. The work was brutal, filled with threats, resistance, and political pressure, but she had never wavered. Silver Rest was meant to be a haven, a place to reclaim peace after the relentless battles she fought daily. But peace was a luxury, not always granted, especially to someone like her. As she rounded the bend near a quiet stretch of the jogging trail, the low rumble of an approaching car broke the tranquility. She barely paid attention at first. It was common for patrol cars to make their rounds, but something about the slow, deliberate way it matched her pace made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She glanced over her shoulder. The car was following her. Lenora sighed inwardly, her pulse steady, but her mind already preparing for what was to come. This wasn't the first time. She slowed her pace, pulling out one earbud as the patrol car cut in front of her path, its tires crunching against the gravel. The bright morning sunlight reflected off its polished surface, and as the driver's side door swung open, she finally got a good look at the officer stepping out. Derek Haynes. Even before he spoke, she recognized the rigid posture, the narrowed eyes, the barely concealed suspicion in his face. And just like that, the calm of the morning shattered. Officer Derek Haynes stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting on his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to send a silent message. His stance was firm, his jaw tight, and his eyes assessing Lenora as if she were a problem that needed solving rather than a woman on her morning jog. Lenora had seen this posture before. It was the same calculated authority she had encountered countless times, the kind used to establish dominance rather than serve and protect. She exhaled slowly, reining in the frustration simmering just beneath her composed exterior. Not today. Morning, she said evenly, her tone polite but devoid of warmth. Derek took a step closer, his presence meant to be intimidating. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice clipped, professional, but laced with something else. Lenora arched an eyebrow and gestured toward her running gear, the water bottle strapped to her waist. Derek's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't buy it. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You match the description." Lenora blinked, not in surprise, but in weary recognition. Of course she did. She had lived in Silver Rest Grove for years, but to men like Derek, she would never quite belong. Lenora had encountered this scenario before, though usually from the other side. She had reviewed case after case of racial profiling, dissected countless reports of officers abusing their authority, but experiencing it firsthand, even as one of the highest-ranking investigators in the state, was a bitter reminder of how deep these biases ran. Her voice remained calm. Suspicious activity? Derek folded his arms, his posture tightening. This was the moment where he could have backed down, but he didn't. Instead, he smirked. "No eye on you, I'm guessing." Lenora exhaled sharply, a slow, measured breath. "I left it at home," she admitted, not breaking eye contact. "Didn't think I'd need it for a jog." Derek tilted his head. Convenient. The word hung in the air, thick with accusation. He took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. "No ID, no proof you live here. Sounds sketchy to me." A few neighbors had started to pause during their morning routines, their interest piqued by the growing tension. Some held phones discreetly, recording from a distance. Lenora's patience was wearing thin, but she refused to let her frustration control her reaction. "Officer," she said, her voice even firm. "This is a misunderstanding. I live here. I jog this path every morning." Derek ignored her words, choosing instead to double down. "Either cooperate or we're going to have a problem." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. A slow, cold anger settled in Lenora's chest, but she kept her composure. She locked eyes with Derek, measured, controlled. "You're making a mistake," she warned, her tone devoid of fear. Derek's face hardened, his pride flaring. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This was personal. "Is that a threat?" he shot back. He reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around," he ordered, "hands behind your back." Lenora didn't move. She stood tall, her chin slightly lifted, as if daring him to think through what he was about to do. The murmurs from the onlookers grew louder. Phones were no longer hidden. They were now raised, openly recording. Derek's frustration mounted. "Last chance?" he snapped. Lenora exhaled, then shifted fluidly, stepping just out of his reach. Not aggressively, but effortlessly. Calculated. Precise. For a brief second, Derek hesitated, thrown off by her poise, her confidence. It was a mistake. One he immediately tried to correct. "That's resisting arrest," he barked. Before Lenora could say another word, he lunged again, this time grabbing her firmly. This time, she let him. The handcuffs clicked shut, tight against her wrists. And at that moment, Derek thought he had won. He hadn't. Inside the patrol car, Lenora Blake sat with an eerie calm, her wrists still bound by the handcuffs. Through the small window, she watched the streets of Silver Rest Grove blur past, her thoughts racing. Not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. She was accustomed to pressure, years of it, in fact, as part of her work in exposing corruption and fighting for justice. But this was different. She was being targeted simply because of the color of her skin, and that made the situation all the more personal. Her breath was steady, her mind clear. She had faced worse. Much worse, but this moment mattered. She would not let this pass. Outside, the crowd's uproar grew louder as Derek tried to maintain control, his earlier confidence now crumbling under the weight of a growing social media storm. People were already recording, not just on their phones, but also on social platforms. The incident was already starting to go viral, and once it hit the digital world, there would be no taking it back. Lenora smiled faintly as she looked out the window. She knew what was coming. Derek might have underestimated her, but he had no idea who he had just arrested. The patrol car turned a corner, heading toward the station. Derek's radio crackled, and he began to speak with an increasing level of nervousness in his voice. "This is Officer Haynes, Silver Rest Patrol. Spec detained. Violent. Resisted arrest." His words were overblown, designed to make the situation sound far more dire than it was. But the public wasn't fooled. Voices shouted from the crowd, calling out his lies. "Violent! She didn't do anything." A man holding his phone shouted, "We have the video." Lenora looked up, her expression composed, though she could feel the weight of righteous anger simmering inside her. She knew this moment would change everything, for Derek, for herself, and for the community watching. The video was already spreading like wildfire, and she had a feeling it wouldn't be long before the entire country was watching. As the car rolled into the station, Lenora remained calm, sitting quietly in the back seat. Derek, however, was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he opened the door and dragged Lenora from the car. Inside the station, Derek Haynes was still under the illusion that he had done the right thing. His ego was fragile, and now, with Lenora's arrest, he thought he had a victory to show for it. He swaggered into the room, holding the paperwork as if it were a trophy, a misguided display of authority that only highlighted his ignorance of the situation. Trespassing. Resisting arrest. Combative. He declared loudly to anyone in earshot, hoping that the room would echo his narrative. His chest puffed out, and for a moment he seemed to regain some semblance of control. But Lenora wasn't playing his game. She stood silently, the only sign of her knowing exactly where this was headed being the faintest of smirks that danced on her lips. Then, just as Derek was about to celebrate, the station doors burst open with a commanding thud. Chief Inspector Rhea Winslow entered with an air of authority that immediately shifted the room's atmosphere. The soft murmurings and whispers ceased as she strode to the front, tablet in hand. Her eyes locked with Derek's, and without a word, she slammed the tablet onto the counter, displaying the live-stream footage of Derek's unjust arrest. The camera had caught everything: his aggressive behavior, his lies, and the growing crowd of witnesses who had clearly seen through his actions. "Derek Haynes, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Rhea's voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at the footage, every word laced with both disappointment and authority. Derek froze, the color draining from his face as he realized the full extent of his mistake. His misjudgment wasn't just a poor decision. It was an exposé of his own biases, his inability to see beyond his assumptions. The reality of the situation began to settle in, and Derek found himself struggling for words. He stammered, trying to justify his actions. She said she lived here, but I didn't know." Chief Winslow's gaze turned icy. "Lenora Blake, you arrested Lenora Blake, director of the State Ethics Bureau. Your superior. The room fell silent. Everyone in the station was staring at Derek, but it was clear from their faces that none of them were surprised. They knew his history. They knew the pattern of misconduct he had carried with him for years. Lenora stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "I warned you, Derek," she said softly, though the weight of her words hit harder than any physical blow. Rhea's voice rang out again, her tone cutting as she addressed the entire room. "Effective immediately, you are suspended, pending a full investigation." She turned to her team, already aware of the deeper issues that needed addressing. "We've had enough. Let this serve as a warning to anyone who believes they can abuse their power without consequence." As Derek was led out, Lenora's gaze remained fixed on the screen, where the footage was still playing. Accountability had been set in motion, And Derek's downfall was just the beginning. The weight of the moment lingered long after Derek Haynes was led away. His suspension was not just a personal failure. It was a symptom of a greater problem, one that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Lenora Blake knew this wasn't about a single officer making a mistake. It was about a system that enabled men like him to thrive. As she walked out of the station, the crowd outside had grown larger. The video of her unjust arrest had already spread across social media, news outlets, and community forums. Silverest Grove, the quiet suburban town known for its affluence and order, was now in the middle of a national debate about racial profiling and abuse of power. A young woman rushed forward, phone in hand. "Blake, what happens now?" Lenora paused, scanning the sea of faces, some angry, some hopeful, some uncertain. She had spent her career fighting corruption in government institutions, but this was different. This was personal. She stepped onto the makeshift podium, standing on the front steps of the station as cameras and microphones crowded toward her. Lenora took a deep breath. Then she spoke. "I want to start by thanking those who stood witness today." Lenora's voice was steady, unwavering. "The power of public accountability is stronger than ever. You recorded. You recorded. You recorded. You spoke out. And because of that, we are here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Affirmation, agreement, anticipation. "But this is not just about one officer," she continued. "This is about a culture of unchecked authority, where bias replaces reason, where power is misused to control rather than protect. And that, my friends, is what we need to change." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Fire him! We don't want cops like that here!" Lenora shook her head. "Firing one officer won't fix the system." The crowd quieted. They were listening. This isn't just about Officer Haynes. It's about every case like this. The ones that didn't go viral. The ones that didn't have cameras recording. The ones where justice never came. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Lenora scanned the crowd. "We have to demand more than individual accountability. We need institutional reform." Lenora's speech sparked something, but it also divided the town. On one side, there were those who rallied behind her, demanding change. Local activists, civil rights leaders, and even some law enforcement officials joined the conversation, calling for stricter accountability measures and racial bias training. The case had drawn attention from state officials, and within days, discussions about police reform policies were taking shape. But not everyone welcomed change. There were those who resisted, who believed that Derek had done nothing wrong. He was just doing his job, a man muttered on a local radio show. "We don't need some bureaucrat telling us how to police our own town." Backlash came swiftly. Anonymous online groups defended Derek, claiming he was being punished for doing his duty. Some business owners in Silverest avoided speaking out, afraid of alienating customers. And within the police force, there was a split. Some officers acknowledged the problem, while others saw Lenora as a threat. For the first time in years, Silverest Grove was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. It was never as safe and fair as it pretended to be. Chief Rhea Winslow wasted no time. The internal review of Officer Haynes revealed a disturbing pattern: multiple complaints of racial profiling, use of excessive force, and targeting black residents. None of them had resulted in disciplinary action. "This is the problem," Rhea said, slamming the report onto the conference table in a meeting with her top staff. Lenora sat beside her, arms crossed. "This department has covered up complaints for too long," Rhea continued. "Haynes was a symptom. We need to start treating the disease." A younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "With all due respect, Chief, not everyone's like Haynes." "I know that." Rhea's tone was firm, but not dismissive. "But that doesn't change the fact that for years, good officers have stayed silent while bad ones thrived." Silence. Then, one officer spoke up. "What do we do?" Lenora leaned forward. "First, we change the way this department operates. Transparency, body cams, racial bias training. But more than that, we change the mentality. Every officer should know that they don't just work for this department. They work for this community." But not everyone supported the change. Some officers quit in protest. Local politicians pushed back, claiming the town was becoming too political. Still, progress continued. 1 month after the incident, Derek Haynes was officially fired, not just for the incident with Lenora, but for his history of misconduct. His supporters called it unjust. But for many, it was long overdue. As Lenora sat in her office reviewing the latest reports, a soft knock came at the door. It was Rhea Winslow. "You did it, Blake." Lenora smiled tiredly. "We started it." Rhea nodded. "You know, this could have gone differently. If no one had recorded that video." Lenora leaned back in her chair. "That's the scary part, isn't it? We only got justice because people saw. But what about the ones who don't have a camera watching?" Rhea exhaled. "Then we change the system so they don't need one." Lenora's resolve hardened. Because this fight wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The story of Lenora Blake's unjust arrest didn't stay confined to Silver Rest Grove. It exploded across the country. By the end of the week, national news networks had picked up the footage. Headlines flooded social media, ranging from outrage to debate. High-ranking state investigator arrested while jogging, racial profiling or standard procedure. Officer suspended after arresting black woman without cause. The system under fire. Viral video sparks renewed calls for police reform in small-town America. Within days, civil rights activists, legal experts, and even politicians weighed in. Some law enforcement officials defended Officer Haynes, arguing that he had been unfairly targeted in a media frenzy. Others acknowledged the deeper issue, a system where bias influenced decisions before facts ever did. For the first time in years, police reform was back in the national spotlight. In Washington, D.C., the footage reached the highest levels of government. Senators and representatives debated whether this was an isolated incident or a symptom of a national crisis. Progressives saw the event as undeniable proof that racial profiling still plagued law enforcement. Conservatives argued that cases like this were exceptions, not the rule. Centrists tried to balance both sides, calling for accountability without vilifying police as a whole. One congresswoman, a longtime advocate for criminal justice reform, gave an impassioned speech on the House floor. If a high-ranking state official can be profiled, harassed, and wrongfully arrested in broad daylight, imagine what happens to those without her power, her platform, or her ability to fight back. Her words echoed across the country, sparking a renewed push for police accountability laws. Meanwhile, law enforcement unions fought back, arguing that officers were being unfairly scrutinized, their jobs made harder by public distrust. It was a battle of narratives, and neither side was backing down. Online, the outrage was unrelenting. The hashtag Jogging while black trended for weeks, with thousands sharing their own experiences of racial profiling. A black attorney posted, "I was stopped outside my own home last year because I looked suspicious. This is bigger than one case." A police officer tweeted, "Incidents like these make my job harder. Good cops don't want to work in departments that protect bad ones." A viral post read, "It's not just about Lenora Blake. It's about the ones who didn't have a camera watching." Celebrities, athletes, and activists amplified the movement, using their platforms to keep the pressure on. The more people spoke out, the harder it became for those in power to ignore the issue. Back in Silverest, the town was forever changed. Some businesses posted signs supporting racial justice. A town hall meeting drew hundreds, the largest gathering in Silverest's history. Local elections saw a record turnout, with citizens demanding leaders who would hold law enforcement accountable. Meanwhile, the police department faced internal upheaval. Some officers left the force, unwilling to accept the new oversight measures. Others stayed, determined to rebuild trust with the community. The new Community Oversight Board ensured complaints were no longer ignored or buried. The change was slow, but it was real. For Lenora Blake, this wasn't a victory. It was simply the beginning of the work ahead. Across the country, lawmakers began introducing new legislation. Stricter penalties for officers who falsified reports. Body camera policies that prevented footage from being hidden or altered. Stronger community oversight boards, ensuring transparency in investigations. One state even introduced the Lenora Blake Act, aimed at preventing racial profiling and increasing training on implicit bias. While the world moved forward, Derek Haynes fell into obscurity. He lost his badge permanently. No other department would hire him, fearing backlash. For a while, he tried to defend himself, claiming he had been unfairly targeted. But the evidence was undeniable. Derek wasn't just a bad officer. He was a reflection of a larger issue. And the system was finally ready to hold people like him accountable. Months later, Lenora sat in her office, reviewing the newest batch of cases. A letter sat on her desk, sent by a young woman from Silverest Grove. "Because of you, I feel safe jogging in my own neighborhood. Thank you for fighting for us." Lenora read the words slowly, her resolve strengthening. She had never set out to become a symbol of change. She had simply wanted justice. But now, she understood the power of her voice. She understood that change was never given. It was demanded. And she was just getting started. This story isn't just about one bad cop or one wrongful arrest. It's about a system that enables abuse of power. A community that chose to fight back. The power of video, social media, and public pressure in demanding justice. The fact that real change takes time, persistence, and courage. And most importantly, this is not just fiction. This is reality for millions. That's why stories like this matter. That's why we keep telling them.